If you're on your own later in life, even though you've been married and had children, apparently that means it's probably your fault. Did you know that? Because a lot of people seem to think it, even if they'd never actually say it to your face. You must have chosen the wrong person. You must have done something wrong. Your children don't come around as often as you expected them to. Well, what did you do to them? You're single again. Now we know why. And I think this is one of the cruelest and laziest ways we judge people, because life simply does not work like that. Most of us didn't go into marriage expecting it to fail. We didn't get married thinking, well, let's see how long this lasts. We wanted the happy ending. Of course we all did. We all know how the rom-com goes. Boy meets girl, they fall in love, and something goes a bit wrong. They have a bit of a falling out, and for a while it looks hopeless. Then somebody realizes they've made a terrible mistake. They get back together, the music swells, and then there's the happy ending. That's how they go. And we wanted the happy ending too. And I don't even think you can say we all drank the Kool-Aid, because other people actually achieved it. We saw other people achieving it. We knew these people who got married and had children and built a life together and stayed together for 40 or 50 years, sometimes longer. So we knew it was achievable. We knew it was possible, but we also knew there were plenty of marriages that didn't make it. And the statistics back that up. So relationship breakdown is not something strange. It happens to millions. Perfectly ordinary people. People who went into meaning well. People who loved each other. And people who tried. They stayed for years. And people eventually realized simply it wasn't working. And I think we forget that. Before I go any further, guys, I just wanted to mention something. I've been getting some, pretty good views on some of these videos that I'm making. And I'm also noticing, though, that quite a lot of you are watching, but you're not subscribing. So I'd love you to come on board. I'd really love that. So please think about subscribing and make my day. I have people in my own family who got married incredibly young, and they couldn't possibly have known at that age what it was going to be like 40 or 50 years later. They were still growing up themselves in many ways. They were still discovering who they were, and yet they made it. One of my brothers married a young woman not long after she left school, and they had 4 children. And more than 50 years later, they're still together. And another brother met his partner very young too, so he would have been probably in his early 20s, and more than 40 odd years later, and 2 children, they're still together. So when somebody says, well, you got married too young, you didn't know yourself, you should have asked more questions. Well, maybe, but neither did those couples. They were still growing as people. And somehow it just worked out. So what was the difference? Did they just get lucky? Well, maybe. They were more adaptable. I don't know. Maybe. Maybe they were better accepting each other's differences. Maybe that's it. And they were less attached to having everything exactly their own way. Possibly that's it. I genuinely don't know the answer, and I don't think anybody really does, because then you have other people, well, like myself, who married young and eventually realised this probably wasn't the right match for me, and that doesn't mean the other person was a terrible person in any way. Sometimes 2 perfectly decent people simply want very different lives. One person might be quite ambitious, and the other person might be quite happy with having much less, a simpler life. And one person might desperately want to own a home and save money and build financial security. The other person might be just content to keep renting even and live on the smell of an oily rag, and neither one of those is completely wrong. But put these 2 people together long enough And that difference can become rather enormous. I still cannot tell you why some couples make it and others don't. I have known couples where if you had asked me to put money on them, I would have bet against them. Honestly, against all odds, they made it. And then I've known other couples who seemed absolutely rock solid. They were the couple everyone admired. A beautiful home and happy family, good jobs and lovely holidays. They seemed to generally enjoy each other. Everything looked so right. And then one day you hear they're getting divorced. And everybody says the same thing. What happened? Well, we don't know what happened because we were looking from the outside. We don't know what happens behind closed doors. And that's where I think we need to be a lot more careful, because we are incredibly quick to look at somebody else's outcome and decide we understand their story. Their divorce. They must have failed somehow. Their adult children don't see them very often. They must have done something wrong as parents. They're living alone. There must be something difficult about that person. And you've probably heard this one. Oh, now I know why he's single. Or, now I know why she's single. I don't like that saying. I hear people say this all the time, and I think it's a bit mean, because what are we actually saying? That if somebody is single later in life, there must be something wrong with them? That if they were lovable enough, attractive enough, agreeable enough, easy going, good enough, somebody would have stayed. Sometimes relationships end because they change. Sometimes people discover differences they simply cannot live with. Sometimes somebody crosses a line and the other person just cannot get past it. That line might involve, another person. It might be financial, and it might be something completely different. Everybody has their boundaries. And yes, sometimes somebody generally does the wrong thing. But a lot of the time, there isn't one obvious villain. There are just two people who could not make it work anymore. And then on the other side, some couples stay together through absolutely everything. They argue, they bicker, they have the same disagreement for 40 years or more. They never resolve a lot of things, and somehow they stay together. We all know couples like this. I know you do. Maybe they are more tolerant. Maybe they're just more adaptable. Maybe they know the grass isn't necessarily greener. Maybe being on their own worries them more than putting up with the things that annoy them. And you know what? That isn't necessarily such a bad thing, really. Sometimes knowing that the grass isn't greener is just wisdom. I don't have the answers, though, and that really is the point. None of us do. But somehow we were given this expectation that if you do life properly, there is a certain outcome waiting for you. You get married, you have children, you work hard, buy the house, and you're responsible. You look after everyone, and then eventually, there you are. Your partner is beside you, and your children are visiting you, and the grandchildren are coming around, and everybody's together. The happy ending. And sometimes that really does happen, and I think that is absolutely great when it does, but there was never a guarantee. And perhaps by the time we get to our 60s and 70s, we finally understand that. And maybe that is one of the reasons so many older people who have already been divorced once or maybe twice say, I'm never going to legally get married again. Notice I said legally married. That doesn't necessarily mean that I never want another relationship. It just means I don't want to legally entangle everything again. And I really understand that one, because at this age it could get really messy. You may have your own home, your own savings, your own superannuation, your children, possibly your grandkids as well, and your estate. You may have spent 40 or 50 years building whatever security you have, And suddenly bringing somebody else into your home can feel very different at 65 or 70 than it did at 25. That can be pretty scary. It can become a legal minefield because at this age, we can't afford to lose the roof over our head. We get carried away with the romantic notion of sailing off into the sunset with the perfect partner. That's a very different risk when you're older. And maybe that's why living apart together makes so much more sense for so many people now. It's your house, my house. We spend time together. We go away together. And we stay over. We have our dinners together and our companionship, and we have intimacy, and we have a relationship. But we don't necessarily have to combine absolutely everything. But at 65 or 70, it can sound incredibly sensible because most of us don't want extra stress as we get older. We don't want huge financial complications, and we don't want arguments about money. We don't want arguments about whose house it is. It doesn't mean we don't believe in, well, love. It means we've learned that love and financial security are two completely different things. But marriage is only one part of this, because the other part is the expectation of children. Having children and raising them and loving them, being there for them, sacrificing for them, and one day we think they'll be there for you, except that isn't always the guarantee either. And this is where I think we have to be really careful about blaming parents when adult children don't show up in the way that other people think they should. Because I can look backwards now and admit something myself. There were people in my own family I could have shown up more for. A parent, a grandparent, and at the time they seemed incredibly capable. They dealt with everything. They didn't complain, and they didn't tell us much about how they were feeling. They didn't sit down and say, I'm a bit lonely, I'm a bit frightened, and I'm struggling. I need some help. So we assumed they were okay. Looking back now from this age, I think they were probably times where they were nowhere near as okay as I thought they were. And if I could go back and understand what I know now, I'd probably do some things differently. I'd probably show up more. And I would look past that capable exterior, because sometimes the people who look the most capable are the people nobody checks on. Everybody thinks, well, they're fine. They're always coping. And that has made me much less judgmental about adult children too, because sometimes children are not deliberately neglecting a parent. They generally think mum and dad are doing okay. They see mum going out and she's out walking and, like me, swimming and dancing. She gets herself around. She appears to pay all the bills and she isn't ringing them up and asking for any money. She isn't calling every day and saying, I'm not coping. So they think, well, mum's doing fine. Mum can cope. And maybe mum looks like she is coping because she has spent her entire life protecting those children. Parents just do that. We don't suddenly stop being parents because our children turn 30 or 40 or 50. We know they have their own struggles, their jobs and their bills and their relationships. They have their own children, their own health problems, their own worries. And a lot of parents would have to get pretty desperate before they picked up the phone and said, I need help. I know that myself. There have been periods in my life when I genuinely did need some practical help. I went through a time where I couldn't drive myself to certain medical appointments. It was too far away. I had procedures where I needed to have done and somebody to take me and bring me home. And I had to ask my son. And he always obliged. He was really kind about it. But I asked because I genuinely had very little choice. Otherwise, like a lot of parents, I tend to deal with things myself. And that creates a strange situation sometimes. We don't tell our children what we need because we just don't want to burden them. They don't realise we need anything. And then occasionally we feel a little hurt that they didn't notice. That's human, I suppose. And maybe as we get older, we have to get a little bit better at saying, actually, I do need some help with this. Or, I don't have the energy for that, or I can't afford to do that for you. And that is not always easy, particularly for mothers. We've spent years putting our own needs and wants aside for our children. As I'm getting older, I'm becoming much more conscious of preserving my energy for myself. And I think a lot of us are, because eventually you realise I matter too. My resources matter, my energy matters, and my money matters. And there is nothing selfish about recognising that. But there's another part of all of this that I think we struggle with. Life is not always fair. It just isn't. And perhaps we need to stop pretending that everybody gets what they deserve. They don't. There is this idea that if you make the right choices, work hard and treat people well and raise your children properly and generally do the best, somehow life owes you a good outcome. You know it doesn't. I wish it did, but it doesn't. Some people draw the short straw. Some people simply have a heavier load to carry. Not everything is equal. Somebody can be a wonderful spouse and still be left. Someone can be a loving parent and still have children who struggle. Somebody can work hard all of their life and still have financial problems. Somebody can look after their health and still become sick. Somebody can be generally a decent person and still have terrible things happen to them. Life does not distribute its problems according to who deserves them. And sometimes you can do everything you thought was right and you still lose. That isn't negativity, that's reality. And perhaps once we accept that, we could become a little kinder, because when we stop looking at somebody else's difficult life and immediately asking, what did they do wrong? Maybe they didn't do anything terribly wrong. And this is the part I really want people to think about. Stop judging somebody from the outside. You don't know their story. Even if you think you know their story, you might not. You know bits and pieces, and you know some of the chapters. You know what they've chosen to tell you. There are things in all of our lives that other people will never know. There may be something you have only ever told one other person in the entire world. There may be some things you've told nobody. Not everyone needs to know everything about us. So when somebody is standing in front of you at 65 or 70 or 75, divorced, single, living alone, perhaps with adult children that don't see them often, you can't look at the ending and reverse engineer their entire life. You can't say, well, there you go. They obviously made bad choices. Maybe they did make some bad choices. We all have, haven't we? But maybe they also loved deeply and worked hard and raised their kids well. And they tried again and forgave people. They compromised and stayed when things were difficult. They stayed longer than they probably should have at times, and eventually left when they realised that they just had to, and then somehow rebuilt. That matters too. I certainly don't look back on my own life and think every decision I made was completely brilliant. Of course it wasn't. There were things I would do differently now. There are things I understand differently now. But I also don't believe everything that didn't work out was a failure. Sometimes two people simply weren't suited to building the same kind of life together. Sometimes you discover what you can live with, and sometimes you discover what you can't. And strangely enough, as I get older, I understand more and more why some people deliberately choose to remain single. That wasn't really my original choice. I've accepted being single, and there are still things about having a partner that I really miss. I'm not going to pretend there aren't. But there are also times now when I much prefer being on my own. And perhaps the older I get, the more I appreciate it. It's your own space and your own decisions and your own money. Nobody else's moods, nobody else's mess, and nobody else's financial decisions. It's just simpler. And sometimes simpler becomes extremely attractive. I don't think marriage is a lie. I don't really think having children is a mistake at all. I don't think wanting the happy ending was so silly. There was absolutely nothing wrong with what we wanted. I also don't think those of us whose lives went in another direction should be treated as though we failed some kind of test. There was no test. There was never a guaranteed formula. Marriage plus children plus hard work did not come with a warranty. And people change all the time, circumstances change. Some things worked and some things didn't work. And here we are, still standing, still figuring it out. So the next time you look at somebody who has ended up alone later in life, maybe don't ask, what did they do wrong? Maybe ask, what might I not know? Because I can almost guarantee you there is a lot. But have a great day, guys. And you take care of yourselves now. And I'll see you in the next one.